Yeah. All right, everybody. I guess y'all are all excited about this week. We have warmer weather and no storms predicted. But what I'm going to do today is start off talking about the situation as it presents itself. Here's the problem: is lenders now are doing the same thing they did with Hurricane Harvey. They will not fund these loans until they have gotten the appraiser to go back out and certify the properties. And so there could be that element. Your script will always be the same with your buyers, is that they must re-inspect in light of the property's possible damages due to this winter storm that we had. We're not inspectors, neither are the buyers. We have no idea what's there and what's hidden. And you need to place that in writing. And the reason I say that is they can make any choice they want, but we're not going to deviate from the best practices that we have in advising buyers properly. And here's the problem that we have. If there's an issue, and the new buyers submitted, something is uncovered, right? Later, after they own the property. Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay. If there is a property issue and they call their insurance company and try and submit a claim, a lot of times they're going to come out and say, no, this didn't happen while you own the property. It happened to the previous seller. And so it becomes real complicated because they're going back to the previous seller trying to get them to submit the claim, all these different things. And the problem is I don't want you to be brought back into it. This is their situation. Once a contract has funded, we're no longer a part of it unless they want to say that we should have done something. So again, be very, very careful. There are lots of little hidden things that won't maybe be uncovered until we have had the thaw, or they might be hidden because they're so slight or small. We just never know, but we're going to encourage them to make sure that the property is re-inspected based upon something like that. If you have any questions during this time, just take me off of mute, take yourself off mute and just interrupt me and ask me the questions. The other problem I'm going to tell you is we're getting way too many calls from tenants and landlords saying, what do they do? Well, we don't advise landlord and tenants. The only thing you're going to be able to do is reference, tell them that, this lease is between the two of you, the landlord and tenant. Reference the lease, paragraph 17. That was the obligation that the tenant was required to provide to secure the property under these conditions and make sure and limit whatever possibility of an issue could occur. And then the landlord, based upon repairs, that's paragraph 18. We have a lot of situations where buyers went somewhere where they were warm versus maybe securing the property properly before and then not being able to get back to the property. And it's very complicated, but it's not about us. It's between the landlord and tenant only. So please don't get sucked back into this. Those are two paragraphs that reference exactly what the tenant's obligation was and then what the landlord's obligation is regarding repairs. Okay. So they projected that the contract forms would be on TREC's website yesterday. Well, it's not there. It wasn't there this morning. And the reason for that is they had to delay the meeting that they even had for TREC last week because of the storm. I'm going to do a little update on the virtual training that NAR is offering regarding that change in the articles, Code of Ethics, Articles 10-5 for you. Then we're going to do a review of the listing agent checklist and the buyer agent ones and some worksheets and those types of things. So we presented to you when NAR changed the Code of Ethics last year in November, and they have two events that you can log into that are hosted by NAR, one on March 9th and one on April 6th. You can also search NAR's website for breaking down changes to the code. It'll come up on that. But I encourage you to listen to them. They say that they're going to be responding to a lot of questions maybe regarding the element of now as a license holder, I'm just not in a transaction that I could be subject to the code of ethics. I'm subject to the code of ethics in my personal life as well, or anything that I might post, any disparaging remarks, slurs, or comments against the protected classes. So again, that's real good information for y'all to be able to attend and get your questions answered. Now, for our listing agent, we're always telling them, buyer's agents what they should ask prior to an offer. But there's a few areas where listing agents got into a little problem with their sellers because they didn't gather enough data for a seller at time of offer was presented. And so I'm going to comment on these things, but I want you to know you need to visit with the sellers regarding this. Would this be something that you would want me to inquire about, right? It's not discriminatory. It's transactionally based. The problem is you'd have to do it on every last one of them if you want to make sure you don't discriminate. But the thing is that the seller, if they want you to do this, you probably put it in your special provisions of your listing agreement or amend the listing agreement to include that. Make sure it's always with their permission, and that you'll provide questions to a prospect or buyer's agent about the buyer situation. The first one says, does the buyer have a property to sell in order to purchase this property? Well, in the market that you have right now, there are lots of buyers that know that the seller won't consider an offer that's contingent upon the sale of their property. And so they fail to do that. They don't protect their interest. And it's important that the seller really know that. A lot of times when we have buyers who come from out of our area, we can't check their property in MLS. We'd need to inquire about that. As I said, the seller probably wants this data before they agree to an offer that's being presented. The other thing that got a listing agent into trouble is it says, is the buyer currently under a lease in an apartment or house, and they would have to give notice to a landlord for early termination or termination in order to close on this property. That was really critical. And the seller really felt that the listing agent should have known that, right? Well, we don't usually know that typically unless it's being presented to us, right? But there is nothing wrong with the listing agent inquiring about this because it's important that the seller would know this. Let me take you one step further where it really caused the problem. The buyer had told the buyer agent, yeah, I've taken care of it, right? So the buyer agent doesn't have any duty to further inspect, right? They've got the information. The buyer made that statement to them. The problem was the buyer, as a tenant, had failed to secure in writing an agreement with the landlord. I think they posed the question to the landlord and they had a discussion maybe, and the landlord made indication that they would allow the tenant, but they did not agree in writing. So when it came down closer to the closing date, the loan officer declined the buyer individually because they couldn't get out of their other lease and they couldn't pay on a lease contract and a loan at the same time for this property. So the buyer was in default of the contract, but the seller was fit to be tied because they said, I never would have accepted their offer had I known that. And that's why I said it's a data gathering element. Sellers can make their own decision, but if they're interested in knowing that, and that can be critical as far as performance on the buyer side. The other thing is a lot of sellers want to negotiate a seller's temporary residential lease at time of offer because they know that if it comes up later in the contract process, the buyer doesn't have to allow that, right? And so it's in the best interest of a seller to find out if they'd be able to negotiate this at time of offer. They have better leverage is what the problem is. And the problem we've had is that the sellers negotiated because that was a smart maneuver on their part. They wanted it. And as they got closer to the contract closing date, the sellers realized they didn't need it, or maybe didn't need it for as many days, right? And so what happened is they tried to do an amendment to modify the terms on the seller's temporary residential lease, and the buyer refused. They said, no, I've already made accommodations for you. I'm not going to reduce it. You're still going to owe me all the money, even if you don't need it. So again, it's better for a seller to always try and negotiate at time of offer, because they have a little bit better negotiating position than if they waited after the contract was executed on something like that. Any questions? Okay, well, now we're going to look at the listing agent, so to speak, little guide. And this is in reference to a lot of our contract changes that will be mandatory April 1st, but could be the moment Trek publishes them. You know, you could see them as an offer and buyer's agents could use them. But make sure paragraph 2 is covered very well. What items are going to convey or items that they're going to exclude. In paragraph 4 of the contract, it talks about leases. So you're going to want to make sure you've uncovered all of that information with your seller regarding the residential lease, the fixture lease, or any natural resource lease, with the documents and information that's required to provide to the buyer. The next one is paragraph 10, the smart devices. I don't want you involved in receiving it. I don't want you involved in conveying it. Listing agents really need to get the sellers to place all of the information regarding paragraph 10, what they're obligated to provide to the buyer, and prove to the buyer that they've terminated all of their access, in a sealed envelope to the escrow officer with instructions to the escrow officer to deliver to the buyer once it's funded. Okay, that's what your seller should do. You're not going to do that. You're not going to be a part of knowing what's in there. We're going to treat it very confidentially, as it should be. Okay, and again, there are lots of things that we always want to get our sellers' consensus on and their permission to review. As I said earlier about the various things about do they now need to sell the property in order to purchase this property. So again, listing agents just take a little bit more time when it comes to reviewing those new provisions that will impact the seller at time of offer. Try and accumulate all the data that you can so that you can present it timely, and then make sure that the seller has included a request for you to investigate and further require data for them in light of what the situation might be for the buyer as far as their previous property or a lease or on an apartment or a home. Any questions? Okay. Now, buyer's agents. Very similar to some of the things that were on the listing checklist, but you have a whole lot more, because your buyer needs to know a lot more of these items before they go forward with an offer. So you need to find out, so that the buyer knows, is the property subject to a residential lease, a fixture lease, or natural resource lease. If there's a fixture lease, you can talk about if the buyer wants to assume it. Our suggestion probably would be no, because the buyer would need to find out if they're going to finance from the lender. They would need to know, would they be subject to some issues if they went forward trying to assume this fixture lease that the seller has. But again, it prepares the buyer knowing this. There are some lenders that are going to say the buyer can't provide a residential lease because they have to own or occupy it. It's not being purchased as an investment property. You're going to find out, are there any exclusions of real property that will not convey to the buyer? That's at exclusions that would be placed in the contract in paragraph 2. Your buyer needs to know that. We have a lot of issues that come up after closing, and they're over usually those items that the seller took that were in the contract to be conveyed, and there was a failure on the part of the listing agent to make sure that they were excluded items. Are the sellers subject to further? The buyer needs to know this. We have a lot of title companies that won't assist the buyer with this, and the buyers will be subject to collecting those monies from the seller at time of closing and submitting proper documentation to the IRS. That's a lot of work for a buyer to take on, and some may just not be interested in doing that.
So Marilyn, Okay, so when we take a listing and we've got a list of things that the seller is willing to leave, and the buyer's agent and the buyer don't provide a non-realty items addendum to that, what are we to do? If the washer and dryer are, included in the sale per the MLS, and they have not provided the non-realty items addendum, what do? Do they leave it? Do they not?
Well, they don't leave it. MLS doesn't convey contractual. Only what's in the contract is what will come into play. So the buyer agent really needs to do a really good job for their buyer.
Okay, and so if, as the listing agent, if they have not done that, and if you have said, do you want these things with a non-realty items addendum, and you get no response,
Well, that's fine.
you
That's
remove
the
the
buyer
items.
agent's duty to represent the buyer. Buyer agent is
Okay.
responsible for attaching the non-realty item addendum to the contract.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because sometimes people don't communicate well.
Well,
Thank you.
As I said, MLS doesn't convey the contract. We are responsible in MLS for presenting a true picture and not misrepresenting something, but the contract is between the buyer and the seller, and that's the only place that it would impact that. Now, do the sellers have any smart devices? Well, the buyer probably would want to know that, because what would the buyer be expecting at time of funding? They would be expecting that the seller had complied with the provisions in paragraph 10, what they're required to do. Okay. If the title company is chosen by the seller, confirm how that title company is going to handle the delivery of earnest money and option fee for the buyer. Right now, we have it where the title company will offer various means by which a buyer can deposit their earnest money and option fee, and your buyer just needs to know that. And listing agents, you'll probably want to make sure that you know it as well, so that the seller understands that. How the seller would be able to receive the option fee, because most title companies are not going to disperse it until it's either credited at closing, or it's going to happen that upon termination, then the title company will dispose and disperse as according to the contract terms. Any questions?
Marilyn, I have a question on the fixture lease.
Mm-hmm.
If I am representing a buyer and the buyer is purchasing a home with solar panels, there's a lease, the fixture lease. I'm confused about this. Is the fixture lease on those solar panels, isn't that somehow a lease on that house? Or isn't it a lien against the house in some way?
Well, I don't know what the lease says, but I am going to tell you that we've had many of those vendors that came back and removed the solar panels after it closed and funded. So if the seller doesn't own it, they cannot convey it, okay, unless
Right.
the buyer was willing to assume it.
And so if the buyer is not willing to assume it, I should have the seller have them removed prior to closing.
Well, that's per that addendum, that new addendum that we have.
Right.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
So, and then I could make any damages to the roof would then be another inspection of the roof before closing, is what I would do.
That's what a buyer would have to do once those panels were removed. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Marilyn, I have a question. The FIRPTA requirement, if we find a title company that'll take care of the FIRPTA, is that fine?
Well, it's good from a buyer's perspective that they have somebody to assist them to collect those monies on the closing disclosure, and then assist them with the proper IRS forms that need for reporting. But we've had disputes where the seller said they weren't subject to it, wouldn't give an affidavit, and the buyer, had to be told by the buyer agent, you better not go forward unless you get this clarified either on a sworn affidavit, or the tax attorney for the seller has provided that, or the CPA has provided that. It's just a huge risk for the buyer.
'Cause, I mean, I guess it's just already such a limited market, and I do have a lot of foreign buyers and sellers, and so
But it's not, a foreign buyer is not an issue. It's the
Foreign seller,
seller. Mhm.
right.
It will be when they go to sell the property, maybe, but not when they acquire the property.
Okay.
Mhm. Okay, if there's an existing lease on the property and the buyer is an investor that's going to accept this because they want to add it to their portfolio, the problem for the buyer agent and the listing agent, and I pointed this out when we explained the addendum regarding the residential lease, 3B has a list of what the seller says is true at that time of contract, right? The problem is the buyer's agent and the listing agent are going to have to revisit with this in writing and confirm that those things are still true. That would be the element that you have to kind of keep up with during the course of the transaction. And we have had some issues. We've had issues where things have happened after contract with that tenant that's in the property, and the seller did not provide that information to the buyer that was under contract and things like that. So there is that additional element that you'll have to be monitoring in the event your buyer is acquiring the property and that existing lease will convey to the new buyer at closing and funding. Any questions? Okay, well, now what we're going to do is just kind of review some checklists and that help the buyer's agent. But before I do that, I'm going to show you the whopping big change in the short sale addendum. TREC forgot to do this in November, so they had to go back in December, and they changed the paragraph F that the termination option, unrestricted right to terminate, is now paragraph 5 under the new contract changes. Okay, so that was that change. And then they had to change the notice of buyer's termination of contract. Again, paragraph 1 would say that the unrestricted right of buyer to terminate the contract is now found in paragraph 5 underneath the new contract changes. What I am going to tell you and visit with you, a buyer cannot use this form unless they can mark one of these boxes, or they have to actually identify the paragraph number of the contract or the addendum that they have the right to provide notice and terminate the contract. If they can't do any of this, they cannot use this form. The buyer would be what we call in breach of the contract, in default. And they don't have a right to terminate. So please don't misuse this form. We've had a lot of buyer's agents who've gotten into trouble that the buyer wrote in there they didn't like that the seller didn't complete the seller's disclosure. That's not a part of the issue here. So again, be very careful that you do things because your buyer kind of wants you to do them. But that says that this is a notice that they're following, rather than not pointing to a provision in the contract or an addendum that gives them the right to terminate and get their earnest money back. So please don't do it. It has nothing to do with the release of earnest money. That's a separate issue entirely on the contract. We have had some attorneys that have advised their buyers to send this form and then think the seller has to sign it. I don't know about you, but I can see clearly at the bottom it's a one-way notice. It only goes from the buyer to the seller. Seller does not have to sign it. It is a notice. Okay. So again, just be careful about the use of this form when it's not appropriate per the contract. That would be my biggest concern to you. Okay. Now, I have a checklist here, and it says buyer checklist. Doesn't say buyer agent checklist, does it? No, and there's a reason for that. There are so many agents that are new to this business, and when you go head on into a transaction, you have to know What are all the time limits for the buyer? How do I help the buyer and assist the buyer in compliance with the contract and its terms and its time limits? And the problem was we had a lot of buyer's agents that were new that had no idea how to facilitate a transaction. So I kind of gave this to the buyer agent to use, make the buyer use it so that they can see some of the areas that are required activity during the course of the transaction. And it's a buyer checklist because the buyer is the one under contract, not the buyer agent. Everybody understand that? And I've said that the time limits for the contract is attached to this document. They cannot pluck out of the contract or addenda the dates for performance. That's our job to do that, and that's what we should point out to the buyer. I am working on the changes, and hopefully I'll have them by the end of March so that you can use them. But again, this is really important that the buyer agent understand the buyer is obligated to do these things. We're there to assist them as far as facilitating, giving great advice that we do. We only give good advice, right? And to help keep them on the time limits that are required. So again, I did put in here that, you know, if I ask you to sign something, read it before signing. And if you have any questions, contact me before signing it. Okay. I want it very clear that while you may have explained it to them, if they have any questions, they need to contact you. It's on them to notify you. We have no idea if they have any questions on that. But prior to contract, we're telling them you need to select financing and provide all the required documentation for loan approval. I don't know about you, but I was hoping in 2015 that this would happen. I'm an eternal optimist thinking one day it will happen. I see commercials on TV now for a lender that says, why would a buyer guess what can I afford? What am I approved for? All those things, they recommend doing it what? Prior to submitting an offer. Oh my word, what a revolutionary idea. So hopefully we'll have more buyers that will be doing that. In this market, I would think a buyer would want to do that. It makes their offer much stronger to a seller. You're going to tell the buyer, you're going to set up a weekly schedule to consult with the lender and to review your status. We have lots of lenders who won't talk to the buyer's agent, and they don't have to. They have a fiduciary duty to the borrower. So in the event the lender won't talk to you, that buyer is going to tell you everything and get all the answers for you. So it's on their neck as far as responding to the questions you may have, since the lender won't respond to you. You're going to provide option fee and earnest money cashier's checks to buyer agent, and it must be received within 3 days of executed date with escrow agent. Okay, doesn't talk about the seller anymore. Under the new contract changes, it will be the escrow agent. They may not want to give cashier's checks. They may want to find out some other method. That's fine. Cashier's checks have just been validated by most banking institutions that they're good funds. I don't know about you, but if I was a listing agent, my seller would probably want good funds. It eliminates a lot of this going back and has it been received, has it cleared, all this kind of issues that listing agents and buyer's agents are required to do on those kinds of matters. Now, contract to close date. The buyer is going to be very, very busy during this termination option period. And sometimes if a buyer negotiates a very few days, they're going to be extremely busy, and they should be worried if they don't uncover and do what they need to do, their due diligence during their termination option. And I'm going to tell you, this even applies for when you are representing a buyer who is purchasing unimproved property, and their intended use for that in the future is, I want to build my dream home, I want to do this. That buyer better not get out of their termination option until they have uncovered every element of making sure that they're able to use that property in the future use that they want to. We have lots of issues where E&O companies have just not allowed claims to be approved when it was unimproved property. There's just a huge risk on something like that. We just never know on those types of things. So be very careful on something like that. But contract to close, yeah, we're going to give them the executed date of the contract. We're going to give them the closing date. They better know that that closing date is their performance. It's for the seller too, but it's a big, heavy burden on a buyer. And has the executed contract provided to the lender by a date? Oh, we've had lots of issues in the past where buyer agent didn't provide the executed contract and the lender was really pushed back on the time limit, and it wasn't the lender's fault. So again, make sure that does not go undone. And during your option period, we are advising you the following. If you're paying cash, have the appraisal done during your option period. That's the only time the buyer would have the right to say to the seller, either you negotiate with me or I'm going to have the unrestricted right to terminate. There is no provision for cash and appraisals. You're going to schedule all your inspections, and I mentioned a lot of them because there are at times the need for more extensive inspections, and that's really determined by the property, isn't it? We won't know that until the property is selected by the buyer, but they need to make sure that they understand that they need to inspect thoroughly. If the truck inspector points out certain things, well, then the buyer has to do those types of inspections as well, as long as they understand that somebody has advised them in writing. A lot of times the inspector, if they don't do it, it's going to be on them. Okay, you as a buyer's agent are always going to advise to do what the inspections say. You're not an inspector, so you're not going to override it and say it's not necessary. The one thing that does cause a lot of problems for buyer's agents is the element where the seller has told the buyer, yes, we've done foundation work. It says it's transferable warranty, all these types of things. And what your buyer has to know that report on that foundation work doesn't mean it's good today. It was done maybe several years ago. So your buyer needs to make sure that they contact that company, ask them to come out and inspect and make sure that any of the past repairs were done correctly and they're still functioning properly and secure any warranty. If your buyers did that, you wouldn't get a call after the sale where the buyer finds out the company is no longer in business. That has been way too many cases, and it's really hurt the buyer's agent. Okay, so that's the buyer's requirement to do that type of thing. So just be very careful about those types of issues. We don't ever say everything is okay. They have to do their due diligence and uncover these things. If the company is no longer in business, now the buyer may need to hire a structural engineer, a foundation company to access the foundation condition. What we have here a lot that happens, the sellers were, when they bought the property, they were told there was a transferable warranty, right? They never transferred it. So when now their buyer goes to that company, the company says, hey, your seller doesn't have a warranty to transfer to you. We had that happen a lot. Most of the foundation companies, they have requirements that it has to be done within a certain amount of time. That's the buyer's obligation in paragraph 7 of the contract. Okay, so it's the buyer job to do this. So make sure that your buyers just don't ignore that element on the seller's disclosure if they're aware of previous foundation work and who did it and the previous warranties that might be conveyed. They need to do all their due diligence to determine that. Now, the other element, and they're scheduled in that. Let me just say something generally speaking, because we've had a lot of issues come up on this. But as a buyer's agent, your buyer doesn't get to have anybody come into that property while it's under contract. The seller has to provide permission. So in paragraph 7A, it says at reasonable times, the buyer can have those that are licensed to inspect, right? That doesn't mean that the contractor will come in who wants to remodel the property. That doesn't mean the interior decorator coming in. Do you know what I'm saying? The buyer agent is tasked with making sure in writing that they have communicated who's coming on the property and what they're going to do very clearly when they make that appointment with the listing agent. Okay, that is your job. The buyer doesn't have carte blanche to be bringing an entourage in. During this COVID pandemic, we've had horrendous situations where the buyer agent brought their family and the buyer had you know what I'm saying, too many people, and the sellers had no idea except they were monitoring it through their devices, and they could see that there were all these people in their home. So again, be very careful about it, and especially underneath the types of precautions that we have to go through because of COVID. The next element that we tell the buyer is you need to acquire your insurance bids for your property, period. Most buyers delay that till very close to closing. That is a big problem for them, because what they may find out is while the property is insurable, and the lender will not decline it if it's insurable, it might be price prohibited. The premium is so high that now the buyer is no longer individually approved. We've had that where the buyer was in default. The other thing is some buyers were adverse to finding out this is how much premium I'm going to have to pay. I don't want this property. Okay, they can't do that outside of their termination option. They won't have that unrestricted right to terminate based upon what they're going to find out. The other thing is, I mentioned a clue report here. That's a comprehensive loss underwriting. And what it says is there are some insurance companies that their policy is a very broad policy, but because it gives such a nice broad coverage to a buyer, a homeowner, they want to know, well, what is the history on this property with claims? Because that determines the premium. And so what happens is if they don't get a clue report, that means that insurance company's coverage might not be very broad, or they might not feel that a clue report is necessary for them to rate the premium. But again, it usually uncovers to the buyer something the seller had not conveyed per the Texas Realtors seller's disclosure that they're required. And so again, we want them to inquire and to receive that and uncover everything they can, insurance related to the property, flood insurance, everything that they might need during their termination option. It's in the general information notice, but that's not a fill in the blank form. Nobody ever reads it. I want it where you personally have given this communication and your buyers acknowledge it. Okay, this is your form. You can have people initial each paragraph as you get through that stage and what they've completed. Whatever you want to do, I want you to have an arsenal showing you have done this throughout the course of the transaction in the best interest of the buyer. Now, I do say if it is important to you, verify square footage. Our contracts are not about square footage. And we've had several buyers who the property did appraise for sales price, sometimes more, but it came back with a different square footage number than might have been on the appraisal district or what the seller had provided from a builder and those types of things. Our contract's not about square footage. So what you have to have the buyer understand that if this is important to you, you're going to have somebody come in and measure the property during your termination option. Sometimes if you have your appraisal done during your termination option, you'll have that. But again, our contracts are not about square footage. They're about value. And we've had a lot of buyer's agents get into trouble because buyers didn't understand that. And buyer's agents said, well, it says it has this much. You're always going to quote the source and say, per this MLS report, per this tax report, whatever it is, but you're never going to let them think that if it's not the right square footage, you can negotiate, right? You don't get to do that except if you were in your termination option period, maybe. Verify schools. If that's important to them, they need to do that during their termination option. Verifying taxes and exemptions on the property. The reason I mention that is buyers, agents many times give the tax appraisal information and the buyer is thinking, oh, this is all the taxes I'm going to pay. And those exemptions have nothing to do with them. We've had some lenders who've dropped the ball, who approved the buyer based upon the exemptions on the property. And it turned out, of course, that was a misfire. Somebody finally caught that and realized that the buyer wasn't individually approved and could not acquire the loan for the property. You're going to contact your local police departments to obtain information about criminal activity. If that's important to them, they need to do that, not you as the buyer's agent. That's what they need to do. Now, the problem that we have with the law having changed is that buyers now under contract and a property owners, mandatory membership in a property owners association, they can negotiate with the seller that they don't require the documents, right? Well, during the termination option, they're going to verify restrictions, any violations with the property owners association. They need to do that step if they've waived it, because they would have no provision to terminate if they found out something. So again, they've got lots to do during this time. This is not some time where they get to take a holiday or go on a cruise. This is where they really have to do their due diligence, and you have to tell them to do that. If they choose not to do it, that's on them, not on you, on something like that. Now, after the option period is waived, what we're mostly going to talk about is when they need to get the closing disclosures and the 3-day waiting period, the time elements involved. If they have any questions on that, they're going to consult with their lender. They may choose a residential service company if they've negotiated with the seller in paragraph 7H of the contract. But if they didn't negotiate with the seller, it doesn't mean that they don't get to buy one. So cover that with your buyers as well. The biggest thing, of course, after this point is usually paragraph 2A of the third-party financing addendum, where it talks about individual approval and have you given notice to the seller. So the deadline is a date for our buyers, because we're going to take those number of days and convert them to a date that comes off of our time limits. And the reason for that is that's a real critical part, because the buyer has to make sure that they don't pass that if they don't get the terms that they want in paragraph 1, or they're not individually approved. And if they're not individually approved, or the lender says to them, you need more time, you need to know ahead of time, so that before those number of days lapse, or you get so close to it, that you're able to do an amendment to the contract to extend that time for performance under paragraph 2A of the third-party financing addendum.
Marilyn?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, this is Lauren Archer. One of the things I didn't see in here that I've run into just recently, I have some buyers moving from Woodville into Willis. Well, they own a wedding photography company, and they need terabytes of data, and there are no high-speed internet in there. So that's another thing I think you need to be looking for your buyers, or getting from yourselves. What kind of internet access is there? Because a simple satellite internet connection won't do for these people.
Right, and that's in general information and notice to the buyer. Absolutely.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. In the lease, the tenant has to verify all of that before they sign the lease.
Well, this is a purchase, but
Review the commitment. Okay. It is important for the buyer to review it. If they have any questions, who are they going to be told to inquire with? Title company, the escrow officer, not you. You don't interpret it. But I am going to tell you, here's your issue. You better review it as well. If there's any exception documents that are notated, you better ask for them. Your buyer needs them, because that would be subject to them being able to object based upon what those exception documents have. This is one of those areas. Don't pass it up. Don't be negligent. If you put it on the buyer, that's fine. But if you know that there are exception documents that have been filed and recorded, you need to ask for a copy of them for your buyer. Okay. The only time you wouldn't is if the buyer says, I don't care, and you better get that in writing.
so isn't it, Marilyn, sorry again, isn't it part of our value as a real estate advisor to help them through this? I mean, I've actually, on some properties, I've called the county to see what their ordinances are. Or can they have a chicken on the property? Can they have a business on the property? Are you saying the buyer needs to do all that, or that's just up to us on whether or not we want to assist them?
You're going to have to be careful. If you're the one doing the investigation, you have to have the notice of information from other sources. Otherwise, they're going to hold you responsible.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's without a doubt.
Mm-hmm. I don't know about you, but I would always want the buyer to do their due diligence. They can advise, ask you, what do you think? And if it's a legal issue, you're going to say you're going to consult an attorney. But there's nothing wrong with providing information, but you better document the source and have them acknowledge that in writing. That's my only concern for you.
Absolutely, totally agree with that.
Mm-hmm. The survey is a big thing too, and it says review the survey. And the reason, the commitment could come in at one point and your objections apply. Your survey comes in at another time, the objections apply. They're independent of each other. You don't have to wait until you receive all of them. But on the survey, if they have any questions regarding any of these issues, who do they need to be visiting with? The surveyor. Now, if they're using an existing survey, they don't have one. It's not for them. It's only for lender and title. So they won't have anybody to consult regarding the survey. They chose poorly not to get a new survey. If there are any repairs or replacements the seller agreed to, you're going to tell them to rearrange for a reinspection by the inspector, and paid receipts from seller received on and date. This is a dynamic form. Once you get information that updates it, you're going to put the updated information and send it back to them. So this document is constantly updated and used throughout the course of the transaction. And it shows that you've done these things. As I said, this is not all what you do, but this is a lot of what is involved in every transaction that you will conduct for a buyer. The one big element.
I'm sorry to ask another question, but so when you say this is a dynamic document, let's say we review a survey and they sign and complete it, and then something comes up. Do we keep that as a record and then create a new one that they have to sign again so they sign it once?
If the survey has been updated, the time for objections start over for the new survey. If there's any modifications to the documents, that time for objections starts over.
Okay, but what I'm saying is, do we need a paper trail that they signed it once on one date and then later on another date? In other words, do we need to keep a living copy of a dynamic document, or do we need to have copies of anything that changed ad infinitum? If stuff changes, it doesn't much, but do we need to have multiple copies with multiple dates on it? Do you understand my question?
Well, you could. You have to keep all the documents that are acknowledged by your buyer during the course of the transaction. They're all considered the broker's documents. Correct.
Cool. Okay.
The property must reach lender approval 4 days before closing. Now, I'm talking about all financing that's not FHA or VA. Okay, they don't have to give notice, so it's very different. And the reason for that is, in order for a buyer to be able to terminate that the property didn't meet the lender's approval, they had to actually have the formal notice from the lender along with their notice of termination 4 days prior to closing. And if they don't have that and it's not there, the appraisal hasn't come back, the buyer really needs to try and extend the closing date, because they lose that provision to be able to terminate if the property does not reach approval by the lender. Notice has to be given 3 days prior to closing. That's why the 4 days before closing, they better know what is going on, because otherwise they're going to be scrambling to try and extend the closing date. We've had some where the appraisal came in on the day of closing, and that everybody missed the mark on that. The buyer was in a situation where the seller refused to extend the closing date. So the buyer knew at that point, you are risking everything if you go forward and the property does not reach approval. So again, it doesn't apply to FHA or VA. They don't require any notice, but a buyer under third-party financing with other conventional terms and financing would be subject to it. So again, make sure that the buyer understands that if the lender says, I don't have it back, they can't decline it just because they don't have it back. They have to have it in order to be able to state those things. Again, in the event there is a delay and the lender is not sending you your documents for this 3-day waiting period, you better tell me right away, because I'm going to try my best to try and get you to extend the closing date with the seller. But in the event the seller won't agree to it, that's where the issues come in, where the buyer gets backed up and is in the process of maybe being held in default or breach of the contract. We're going to verify with the lender the amount you need for closing. That's what your job is, buyer, to do that. You're going to do a final walkthrough and acceptance, and it's scheduled for this date. So again, as this information uncovers itself, you will update it Your buyers will update it, or you'll visit with your buyers and they'll tell you, oh, we did that last week, or we found this out. But then fine, get them to initial that part of it, that they gave you that information that they've done it. But again, the biggest concern I have is that the best practices as a buyer's agent are not solid in writing of what you should do and what you do during the course of the transaction. And that's the only way that you're really going to be able to resolve a lot of the issues that come up with a buyer not doing something and then they're thinking that it was your job when it really was their job to do certain things like that. It is your job to facilitate and to assist that buyer in compliance with the terms of the contract. But a lot of times you tell buyers good things and buyers choose poorly. Okay, if that's the case, you just want it in writing forever. Any questions? Okay. Now, what I'm going to do now is kind of go through the worksheet that buyer agents really need to review with the buyer and the lender, the buyer's lender, before they even present an offer. Okay. Now, most lenders, they won't respond to this. They wouldn't sign it or anything. That's just fine, but you can use it as a guide. And when you visit with the lender and your buyer, and y'all are all in a conversation together, and you've asked these questions, they've responded in their best ability, you're going to follow up in writing saying, thank you for taking our call. This is what you conveyed. If I've got anything wrong, please let me know, right? Because that's what's the best interest for your buyer. Your buyer needs to know that lender's making their best guess on all of this based upon a lot of factors. The buyer submitting their information, the follow-up and the timeliness, all those different types of things. But you need to find out if the buyer's assets and income, and review the credit report and application and all those different types of things. If they're going to provide a conditional qualification letter, the type of financing, how many calendar days will you need to provide individual approval? That's because that's in paragraph 2A of third party. We don't pull that number out of the air. We just rely upon it. And again, the lender is giving you their best guess. If the buyer is not forthright in coming with the information, what would that mean? That might be a delay, but it would be your buyer's fault, not necessarily the lender. So be careful about that. You're going to ask them the number of days or the date they would be able to close this transaction. Again, their best guess, but that we're going to rely on what the lender is telling us, not what we're going to pull out of the air, or the buyer. Can the buyer receive a contribution for closing costs from the seller? If they can, what is the maximum amount? You better know this at time of offer based upon, at that time, the loan program. Okay, because that's the best way that the lender is going to be able to give you the information. Could be subject to change, but again, you want to make sure that you don't ever exceed the maximum amount when you're trying to negotiate with the seller. And a lot of times we do these on weekends and after hours when somebody's not available. What are your adjusted origination charges? It's on the third-party financing addendum, so we want them to tell us. Can the buyer provide a seller a temporary residential lease on the contract? And if yes, what is the maximum number of days that the buyer can give the seller? That's important for the buyer to know, because if they're applying for this loan and it's an owner-occupied loan, they're going to be limited based on the loan program. So we just want to confirm from the lender exactly what that is. Again, we're not telling the buyer, the lender is telling the buyer. When will you order the appraisal? Well, we're seeing more and more appraisals done during the termination option, which is absolutely unbelievable. And it gives the buyer a very different perspective on negotiating with the seller. But again, that's not the case. We have a lot of lenders who wait until the very end that a buyer is really strong, individually approved, so that they would let the buyer, their borrower, commit to more funds for those types of transactions. But you need to be prepared for that and understand that. If the property does not appraise for the sales price, will you decline the property approval for paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum? That's real clear. We have lots of buyers that are very strong, credit-wise and asset-wise, and some lenders have said, look, we'll just adjust the terms. I'm never going to decline the property. Well, that's third party. And in the event that they would not decline property approval because it didn't appraise, you might want to consider using the addendum concerning the right to terminate due to lender's appraisal, paragraph 3 for buyer. That gives the buyer their own right, in addition to what the lender has in 2B, but their own right if the property doesn't appraise for the value that they've placed in there, to be able to terminate. So again, it's real important that you understand those prior to going in an offer, so you have all the proper addendum that are required for the transaction for your buyer. If your buyer chooses to lock in the rate, let me know. I need to know that because that affects a lot of negotiations that we have in the course of the transaction, delays that come in, and maybe when a seller might ask to extend the closing date for some circumstance, the buyer might not be in the best position to be able to offer that. If a non-royalty item addendum is a consideration on this offer, well, you have a problem with it being part of the contract. We have some lenders that are adverse to it, even if it's zero, right? And zero usually means the appraiser doesn't have to appraise anything because it has no value. But you just need to know that, because if the lender says, I don't want it, that means it's not going to be on the contract. We don't hide anything from the lender or anybody else. So if the lender says, I don't want it, it's going to be on the lender versus you as the buyer's agent. Please provide the email address and phone number for contacting you on weekends. Some lenders may not want to be contacted, and that's fine. You'll know that going in. But if there is an issue that comes up and you need clarification, or your buyer does, you just want to know, is there an ability for us to communicate with you on the weekend? And then the last one is provide the delivery method for the closing disclosures. A lot of them will be by email. That's usually the most desirable, I think, way of delivering it, but you just want to confirm and make sure. That delivery method is usually between the lender and the buyer, based upon a set of circumstances or where they are. As I said, the lender is not going to own up to any of this. But once you have confirmation that you've either gotten from, the lender's communication between you and the buyer and the lender, and the buyer is telling you this is what the lender told me, you're going to confirm these things in an email saying, I've received the following information from the buyer that the lender said these provisions. If they're not correct, please let me know right away, right? Because you're going to rely upon that in assisting the buyer in submitting their offer on that. And that's, as I said, we have that commercial now that says you need to be approved knowing what you really can afford prior to going under. No more of this leaving it to chance and that kind of thing. The more the buyer is committed to the lender, has provided the documents to the lender, and timely response, the better it will be for the buyer, period. Any questions? No questions?
Hi, Marilyn. Yeah, it's Ty. I just wanted to know, could you remind me where those forms are going to be again?
What forms? The ones that I just went through?
Yeah, like the worksheet.
They were probably all sent to you. I think Gabby sent them all to you.
Okay.
Yes,
awesome.
they're all on the internet as usual.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Those are great. Thank you, Marilyn.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Hey, Marilyn, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So going back to when we're representing the buyers, when it came to, so when there's warranties, like warranty on foundation and things of that nature, we request that from the seller, present that to our clients, and it is our client's obligation to follow up and call, and not ours to.
Correct. It says it so in the contract. The buyer is required to do all of that. Pay any monies that would be needed for the warranty to transfer or whatever else.
Okay, all right. And then
you can monitor that. That would maybe be more your duty to monitor it.
But not necessarily make that phone call for them.
I agree. The more you do that, the more it's going to be on you.
Okay. Okay. And then when it comes to the inspection period from so the seller has, the seller can say yes to reasonable like inspections, but when it comes to people wanting to, buyers wanting to come through with contractors and interior designers, you were saying something about that. Can the seller decline that type of entry?
Yeah, they sure can. That's their property.
Okay, all right.
It-
So
it-
they want to find out about modifications and get quotes on how much it would take to cost to remodel it. They need to do that after closing.
Well, here's what I would recommend. If you are aware that your buyers want to do that, put it in the contract in special provisions where seller agrees to allow XYZ contractor in the property on this date. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
That would be the better way to go. And that's instead of springing it on the sellers. That's not how it works. And a lot of the sellers feel that they were not treated fairly, that the buyer agent hid that from them. So again, if your buyer knows it's going in, that's the best way to negotiate it is that time of offer and special provisions.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Going back to the inspection, that one inspection is ordered by the lender.
I'm
by-
sorry, I could not hear you.
Okay, let me see. Okay, let me see. The reinspection, you can hear me?
Yes, now I can.
Okay, so going back to the reinspection, the reinspection right now to the weather is ordered by the lender, by the buyer, or when the inspection is by inspector or by plumber, or who performed that reinspection?
Well, in light of this winter storm, it could be a plumber, could be a roofer. It could just depending upon it. We have had a lot of roofing issues where water is gushing in because flashing wasn't done properly. Ice and snow is very different than water. And while a lot of the flashing might be able to divert water, when ice goes there and
Okay.
snow and gets trapped.
Some lenders are some lenders are requiring the reinspection. They told us about the appraiser, but it's different, like you said.
Yeah, that's the lender may require the appraiser to go back out and recertify the property, but we're never going to tell the buyer that they shouldn't do that themselves as well. They should hire somebody that is going to be able to inspect the property and make sure there is no damage.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Marilyn, so if you were doing a contract under the special provisions, that's where you would put buyer wants to be, would you spell it out, having this different people come into the property on the dates, or do you leave it fairly open-ended?
Well, here's what I would say. Seller agrees to allow the buyer to have contractors on the property on these 2 days or these dates for, inspections or whatever they want to do, or investigations or quotes and bids. But I think the clearer it is, it may be just really broad and the seller will agree to allow the buyer to have them. The problem is that we've had so many buyers that didn't notify the sellers, buyer's agents didn't, and all these people showed up on the property and the seller is video they're seeing all these people on their property, and then everybody gets angry about it. They're not going to be as positive as we should be during the course of the transaction. So the buyer really needs to try and see if they can get all of this done. Some sellers say, look, I'm not going to be forced out of my home during this time, 3 days for 4 hours. I will do it for a half a day. You know what I'm saying? That is more typical of what we see, is where the seller will negotiate. I'm not going to let you bring people back 3 times. They can come during these times to do that. So it could be that they will negotiate very precisely who's coming in and what times and day. I think the biggest issue, and especially during this pandemic, we've had way too many people get so very upset with the buyer's agents and the buyer doing this without regard for this being the seller's property. And sometimes sellers had to go and wait in a car down the street, or, you know, with a neighbor, just depending upon what was going on during the time under this COVID restrictions and those types of things. So we just need to be more aware as a buyer's agent what might come into play, because 7A is pretty precise. It says for those that are licensed to inspect, not just somebody who's coming in to give you a quote to tear down a wall or build on or add on and that type of thing. And you know, we have a wonderful form for Harris County regarding, you know, improvements to the property and what has to be done. If a buyer's really set on doing that, they're probably going to have a much longer termination option because their due diligence, it'll take them a lot longer to get through it. Any other questions? Okay, well, next month, as I said, we're going to go through the time limits of the contract, the Excel spreadsheet, and highlight some of the, again, rehashing some of the changes that are coming into play and what's being done. So again, we have until April 1st as a mandatory use of the forms. My concern for you is as that date approaches, and when it says it's mandatory, that means that if you're a listing agent and the last week in March, the buyer submits an offer and it's not being expedited between the buyer and the seller, you know, the negotiations are taking longer, or these types of things, you're probably going to really encourage the other party to use the current form, the new form, versus the current one, because the current ones become repealed as of April 1st, and you can't have an executed contract on a repealed form. That's a violation. So we'll talk a little bit more about time limits and what to watch out for when we visit next month. All right, good people, please stay safe. Now it's warm. Not only stay safe and well, but now I want you to stay warm. And I pray that you have great internet access and utilities. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Marilyn.
Bye.
You too.
Thank you.